So really in this section, the CAF will guide you through the migrating itself and also the innovation side of things as well. So the migration process, there's 4 key elements to it: assess, migrate, optimize, secure, and manage. And assess is essentially assessing every associated workload that's basically being migrated. And really the key thing we're looking for at that stage is determining its suitability for migration and which of the 5R approach that we'll basically use for that particular workload. So earlier on the webinar, we took a brief look at the 5Rs and from a top level, but we'll go into that in further detail in a second. But the key thing here is we're looking at each workload, what's its priority, how we're going to get it to Azure, and what is the 5R route for that in terms of methodology perspective. Then to migrate, the key thing that we need to think about here is what tools and what combination of tools that we can use to be able to migrate. So whether it's native or third-party tooling that we decide to use as part of migrating that workload. So for example, you could use Azure Migrate, or you could use Azure Database Migration Service, for example. And then when you're there, it's about optimizing. So optimizing that environment for that transformation. So you might have rehosted something in the sort of interim at the initial first workload stage or first wave of the migration. In the later on waves, depending on your Azure plan, you might want to then start to look at refactoring or looking at how you can make that, whether it's an application or that particular workload, more cloud native to leverage more value from that actual movement to Azure. And then secure and manage, really looking at how we can actually consider security and management element of that particular workload. So sorry, I should say on the optimized piece, it's all around things like resizing VMs, for example, moving a SQL database to SQL managed instance, for example, to again optimize that workload, whether that's across cost, performance, or whatever it might be. In terms of the target end state, this again just gives me further information on what I'm trying to achieve. So key part of the CAF framework is the target end state. This is what is the final outcome for me. And what we do as part of the target end state is we scope those migration candidates, so the 5Rs, we define what we're trying to do for it. But the key part is we map the dependencies. So if I move this particular workload to Azure, what other elements are dependent on this particular workload? And that will really guide your migration waves. So when you move things and in what priority. So if there's something that's business critical that moves, that something that isn't business critical is dependent upon, then that really gives you food for thought in terms of when do I move that other element. I obviously potentially have to move it at the same time, unless as an organization we can do without it for a period of time. So again, it's really about what's dependent upon what, and then planning out those migration waves. And then just as I said, we'd cover off the 5Rs just quickly and in a sort of a basic way. These are a key part of the target end state. So what do you actually do when you migrate that workload to Azure? So whether you rehost, so you move it in its current state to the cloud, whether you refactor by changing the way that it works to fit in with a PaaS model, you either re-architect, again, basically changing that to an extent that becomes cloud native. And then you can either rebuild something. So you essentially decide, okay, that's not going to fit within our priorities. It's not within our motivations. We're going to have to completely rebuild this or repurpose something else already within Azure to get the same outputs that we ordinarily would do. So the key thing there is you either rebuild something in place or you completely replace it. And then obviously replaces 2 elements. You either use a SaaS alternative or you use something that's already within Azure to be able to replicate what that service was delivering to you previously. In terms of migration planning and execution, really we basically advise, and the CAF will advise, using migration waves to prioritize. And that key element there is that section that's highlighted, the plan, ready, and adopt. So for every single workload. As I said, you do the plan, ready, and adopt stage, but there's a really good tool for migration readiness that's at the bottom there, the Smart tool, that will basically give you an overview of all the different workloads that you put as part of that, and help you to prioritize those particular workloads in terms of mapping out a plan or waves of your migration. And the plan, ready, and adopt here, just to be completely clear, is the stages for each individual workload. So planning that workload migration, getting it ready in terms of, do we have the resources available? Oh, sorry, could you put yourself on mute if you've just joined? And then adopting and that's essentially doing the migration execution. And then finally, the migration tooling. So again, back to our processes with regards to making sure those workloads are migrated effectively, assess, migrate, optimize, secure, and manage, and the various tooling that we have underneath that. So again, as you whether you use Azure Migrate to assess that particular workload and the options that it has, whether you use Data Migration Assessment, SQL Server Migration Assistant, Database Experimentation Advisor. From the Migrate side of things, you've got ASR, you've got Database Migration Service, or Azure Data Box. There's lots of different elements within the CAF framework that will give explanation around each of these and how you can use them and how you can leverage them. The key thing is to make sure that you're aware of them as part of your tool set, as part of that that migration. And then there's also third-party solutions. So, for example, at Cloud Direct, we use Moveair a lot as part of our cloud migration assessments. So assessing on-premise workloads and their how they would look within Azure, using Cloudamize from a cost perspective. Lots of different elements here that you can use. We use Lakeside for Windows Virtual Desktop, for example, using these tools to get a really good picture of how and the best ways and the most efficient and effective ways of migrating those workloads through this particular planning tooling, and then obviously moving on to actually doing the migration itself. So we've spoken about migration waves. It's obviously a key factor in terms of prioritizing those workloads, but what's the reason for it? Why not just try and do everything at the same time? The key thing is that we learn and we best prepare for the latter phases. You know, when you're doing something for the first time, you've got this fantastic CAF framework that you're working to that's provided you with all this information and all of these toolings and templates to put in place to make sure that you're as efficient and you know where you're going. But obviously, when you're doing something for the first time, you're always going to be learning. You're always going to be best preparing for next time. And the beauty of having multiple waves is that obviously you're able to incorporate that within your Azure migration. You create manageable work streams. That goes without saying, is that you make things manageable for the organization and reduce that wider business impact. And really, the key thing is that we look to get things right first time. If we just take on too much in one go, then it's highly likely we'll cause problems. We might have missed dependencies, for example, and that causes all manner of different elements that no doubt at Cloud Direct we've come across with unpicking certain customer solutions. And then it also smooths that budget allocation. Again, the key thing of getting sign-off is we don't have to do everything in one go. There are, you know, hybrid scenarios that we can look at in the interim, but there's also, again, getting that priority plan together to say, this is our priority plan and this is the budget we need at this particular time to cover off all of those milestones.